There are worlds in the Imperium of Man that no one remembers naming. Worlds catalogued once in a forgotten census assigned a serial number, filed in the archives of a Mechanicus cogitator that has not been read in 3,000 years. Worlds that orbit dim stars at the fringe of explored space, where the light of the astronomicon barely reaches and the nearest Imperial garrison is 6 months of warp travel away. Worlds where the ground is old. Not merely geologically old, but old in a way that presses against the air, that settles into stone, that makes every step feel like an intrusion into something that was not meant to be found. Solenum Tertius was one of those worlds. The Adeptus Mechanicus survey team arrived expecting nothing unusual. Geological data gathered by an automated probe decades earlier had flagged the planet as potentially resource-rich, its deep crust threaded with mineral deposits and stable cavern networks. The kind of discovery that warranted a modest expedition. 2 tech priests, a contingent of servitor drones, and a small detachment of Imperial Guard soldiers assigned purely as security escorts. The kind of posting considered boring enough to be given to soldiers who had done nothing particularly heroic and nothing particularly terrible. The kind of assignment that exists at the quiet edges of the galaxy, where history is not expected to happen. For the first 2 weeks, it did not happen. The team descended into excavation tunnels bored by drilling servitors, cataloged mineral densities, uploaded data packages to waiting cogitators, and moved through the underground with the quiet efficiency of men and half-men who had no reason to expect anything dramatic. The senior tech priest, Megozervith Solon, was a figure so thoroughly augmented that the organic portions of his body were largely cosmetic at this point. He moved through the tunnels with the measured patience of a machine performing the function it had been built for. He was not curious in the human sense. He was curious in the Mechanicus sense, which is to say he cataloged anomalies and assigned them numerical priority ratings. The anomaly that would end everything received a priority rating of 3 out of 10 when it was first detected. A variation in stone composition. A section of cavern wall where the rock had been worked rather than naturally formed. Hands had shaped this stone. Hands that held tools. Hands that, according to every geological record Solon possessed, should not have existed on this world at any point in its history. He assigned 2 servitors to widen the opening. What they found behind the wall should not have been there. A corridor, low-ceilinged, constructed from massive blocks of pale stone fitted together with a precision that required no mortar. The floor bore a thin, respectful coating of dust rather than the thick burial of centuries. The walls were carved, not with Mechanicus hexagrams or imperial eagles or the geometric markings of any catalogued Xenos species, but with a language that looked like it wanted to be read aloud. Runes arranged in columns, looping and angular at the same time, speaking in a visual grammar that felt simultaneously ancient and deeply intentional. Solon catalogued them. Priority rating 7. The corridor extended 140 meters before opening into a chamber. A burial chamber, by every structural indication, and yet unlike any burial chamber belonging to any culture Solon's augmented memory contained. The ceiling arched upward into a darkness his optical sensors could not fully resolve. The walls bore the same carved runes, denser now, covering every surface in a weaving of instruction and invocation that felt less like decoration and more like a warning written by someone who believed warnings would be necessary. Weapons were mounted on stone brackets, swords with broad blades, axes with recurved heads, all of it aged but none of it decayed. Whatever metal these implements were forged from had not rusted. They sat in the cold, deep air as though placed yesterday by hands that expected to return for them. At the far end of the chamber, raised on a low dais of carved stone, lay a figure, not entombed, not sealed away. A warrior's rest. The figure was armored in layered metal plates and aged fur that should have crumbled centuries ago but had not. Its face was hidden behind a crested helmet. Its hands were crossed over the hilt of a long, dark sword resting on its chest. It had the shape of a man. It had the absolute stillness of a body that had not breathed in a very long time. Solon's auspex returned no biological readings, no heartbeat, no metabolic function, no heat signature beyond the ambient temperature of the room. Dead. Definitively, measurably, completely dead. He directed a servitor to approach the dais and begin a closer scan. Then the chamber changed, not noisily. not with an explosion or a dramatic crack of stone. The change was more fundamental than that. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in 2 seconds. The runes on the walls began to emit a faint luminescence, cold and blue and utterly steady, as though someone on the other side of death had reached up and lit a candle to let a visitor know they were not alone. And from the figure on the dais came a sound that Solin's audio sensors logged without interpretation, because there was no existing category for it. A low exhalation, deep and slow, carrying inside it something not quite a voice and not quite a wind, but unmistakably the sound of something waking up from a sleep that had lasted longer than the Imperium itself. The hands around the sword tightened. The eyes behind the helmet opened. They burned with a cold, pale light that had nothing to do with electronics and nothing to do with the warp, and everything to do with something far older than either. Magos Ervith Solin revised his priority rating to 10. The Imperial Guard soldiers stationed at the excavation entrance heard the alert tone from Solin's Vox relay at 0347 hours, planetary local time. The message was brief and strangely flat in its delivery, the way a man speaks when his brain has registered something extraordinary, but his training has not yet caught up to it. Security breach. Lower level. Bring everything. Sergeant Dara. Vess led 6 soldiers into the tunnels. She had been stationed on Solenum Tertius for 4 months and had spent most of that time playing cards, cleaning her lasgun and resenting the posting with a calm, professional bitterness. She was not afraid of the dark. She was not afraid of ruins. She had fought orcs in a hab trench on Valakis III and had emerged with her bones intact and her sense of humor largely functional. She was the kind of soldier who treated fear as a useful tool rather than a condition to be endured. And she kept that tool sharp precisely because she had learned that the galaxy rarely announces its worst moments in advance. She entered the burial chamber and saw the Draugr standing in the middle of it, and for a full 3 seconds she did not move. It was not standing the way a man stands. It was standing the way a monument stands, weight distributed across centuries, presence occupying space rather than simply filling it. The armored figure was taller than a baseline human by half a head, broad-shouldered, wrapped in metal and old fur that moved slightly as the creature turned toward the new arrivals. The eyes behind the helmet burned with that cold, pale light. The sword it had pulled from its own chest was held in one hand at its side, the blade dark and unnaturally long, catching the blue glow of the runes on the walls and returning nothing warm. It did not speak. It did not growl or screech or make the animal sounds that soldiers had been taught to associate with warp creatures. It simply looked at them the way a soldier looks at an enemy that has just crossed into territory it was not meant to enter, and it began to move forward. Fire, Vess said. 6 lasguns opened up simultaneously. In the close geometry of the burial chamber, the sound was enormous. Bolts of supercharged energy hit the Draugr in the chest, the shoulder, the arm, the neck. They left burn marks. They left scorch patterns on the ancient armor. They did not stop it. It kept walking. Not fast. That was the part Vess would describe later with a particular kind of emphasis. The kind earned by someone who has had to choose their words carefully because the ordinary ones do not quite fit. It was not fast. It moved with the slow, relentless pace of something that had accepted a long time ago that speed was not the point. The point was that it would not stop. Every step was a statement. Every step said that no matter what you put in front of it, the distance between you and it would eventually close. 2 soldiers broke left and right. The Draugr tracked the motion with its eyes but did not alter its course. It moved toward Vess directly, as though she had been designated by some internal logic as the primary obstacle, the one whose removal would restore the proper order of the chamber. She stepped aside at the last second. The sword came down in a vertical arc that would have divided her from crown to hip if she had held still. It hit the stone floor instead and left a cut in solid rock that ran 8 inches deep. Vess looked at that cut for a fraction of a second and recalibrated her entire understanding of the situation. "We are not stopping it with lasguns," she transmitted over the Vox. "I need heavier options now." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a lesson, delivered in the slow, patient language of the Draugr's movement through the tunnel network as Vess and her soldiers fell back ahead of it. Bolter rounds from the 2 soldiers who carried them punched fist-sized holes in the creature's torso. It staggered. It regained its footing. It continued. A frag grenade detonated at its feet and blew it off its stance entirely, sent it sprawling against the tunnel wall in a cascade of ancient stone chips. It rose again, not like something that healed, more like something that had decided the damage was simply not sufficient justification to remain down. Solon's servitors attempted to intercept it at a corridor junction. The Draugr moved through them without breaking its stride, scattering mechanical bodies left and right with a casual force that spoke not of rage but of absolute purpose. These things were in the way. They were moved. That was the end of the matter. It was not a monster driven by hunger or hatred or the mindless violence of a chaos demon. Those things experienced soldiers knew how to frame. A demon screamed and surged and was consuming and frantic in its destructiveness, all appetite and pressure. This was different. This was a warrior, fulfilling what appeared to be an obligation it had made a very long time ago to a very specific set of circumstances, and those circumstances had now occurred. And so here it was. The surviving soldiers regrouped near the surface access tunnel and transmitted their after-action report up the chain of command with the kind of language that gets a message escalated quickly. They had encountered an animate corpse. The corpse was armored, armed, and effectively immune to conventional small arms fire. It had demonstrated strength well beyond a baseline human. It had taken damage that would have killed anything with the biological requirement to remain alive. One soldier, a young trooper named Ferries, who was on his first posting and had not yet learned to restrict his reports to approved terminology, added a single personal observation at the end of his transmission. "It wasn't angry, sir. It just wasn't going to stop. Whatever it was protecting, it would have kept coming forever." I genuinely believe that. A warrior that death could not stop. That phrase, unofficial and entirely unauthorized, would be the one that survived. They came because they had heard about the disturbance. In the grimdark sprawl of the 41st millennium, information travels in many ways. Official imperial channels carry orders, supply requisitions, and declarations of heresy. But information of the useful, dangerous variety travels in other channels, through whisper networks maintained by chaos cultists embedded in civilian populations, through astropathic fragments intercepted by agents of the ruinous powers, through the subtle pressure of warp-touched minds that feel the shape of events before they fully occur. The chaos cult operating in the deep industrial quarter of Solenum Tertius's primary settlement had known something had woken beneath the ground before Solon's alert tone had finished transmitting. Their leader was a man who had once been a minor imperial administrator before the voices found him. He called himself the Witnessing Eye now, which was a grandiose title for someone who was, at his core, a bureaucrat who had traded one kind of paperwork for another, the forms of imperial governance exchanged for the ritual texts of Tsinche. But he was not stupid. He understood power in its various forms, and he understood very specifically that an undead entity walking on this planet represented something he could potentially use. Warp-sensitive cultists had a well-established framework for dealing with the animate dead. The principle was straightforward. Undead entities drew their animation from something. In the vast majority of cases encountered in the 41st millennium, that something connected back to the warp in some fashion, directly or indirectly. The spectral undead of haunted imperial worlds were driven by warp-infused grief. Chaos-raised corpse warriors were puppeted by demonic will. Even Necron reanimation, strange and mechanical as it was, involved energies that brushed against the deeper fabric of things in ways a warp-sensitive mind could detect. Every form of animation the cultists had ever encountered left a thread they could follow, a frequency they could tune into, a door they could knock on. The Witnessing Eye sent 3 of his most capable psyker cultists into the tunnels ahead of a larger armed force. The plan was simple. Find the animate entity. Reach into the warp thread that sustained its movement. Whisper along that thread. Offer it something. The chaos gods were generous to those who served, and a warrior bound by undeath and already accustomed to fighting for an oath could be redirected toward a new oath with the right pressure applied in the right place. The 3 psychers descended into the excavation level. They found the Draugr standing in the main corridor of the burial complex, motionless now that no intruders were actively pressing toward the inner chamber. The runes on the walls still glowed their cold blue. The creature's eyes still burned. It looked at the psychers without recognition, but with the measuring quality of something that was assessing whether these new arrivals constituted a threat. The lead psyker reached into the warp and extended his senses toward the creature. He found nothing. Not nothing in the way a blank psyker is nothing, that screaming void that drives warp-sensitive minds into panic. Not nothing in the way a shielded psyker is nothing, deliberately closed and defended. This was a different kind of nothing entirely. The Draugr existed in the physical world with full material presence. It had weight and mass, and the evidence of its own physical power was visible in the damage still visible on the corridor walls from its earlier passage. But when the psyker reached for the metaphysical thread that should have connected an animate corpse to some source of animating energy, his senses found only a stillness so complete it felt wrong. He tried again. He reached deeper. He pushed his perception further along the spectrum toward the frequencies where warp-touched things lived, where demonic whispers accumulated and solar residue gathered into shapes, and he found that the Draugr simply was not there. Not absent in the way a dead thing is absent. Present in the material world and yet absent from every register the warp possessed. The second psyker described it afterward, before the witnessing I had him silenced for the sake of morale, as feeling like touching a stone that had been warm from the sun 1,000 years ago and had since cooled so completely that it no longer remembered heat at all. The Draugr carried death in it, yes, but not the warp's version of death. Not the screaming, hungry, corruptive death that the ruinous powers fed on and amplified and weaponized. Something else, something older. A death that had been given a purpose and had been holding that purpose in both hands for so long that the purpose had become indistinguishable from the death itself. The witnessing eye's whispers found no purchase. The careful practiced techniques of Tzantkian manipulation, the subtle reframing of obligation, the gentle inflation of grievance into resentment into devotion, found no gap to enter. There was no ego in the Draugr that could be flattered or frightened. There was no unfulfilled hunger that could be offered satisfaction. There was only the oath, laid down in some ancient ritual the witnessing eye's considerable library of dark knowledge contained no reference to, and that oath was sealed with something that the warp could not touch, could not corrupt, and could not even fully see. In the great tapestry of warp metaphysics, the Draugr was a blank space, a silence in the middle of a constant roaring, and that silence, the cultists discovered, was not peaceful. It was deeply, profoundly unsettling, the way the absence of a familiar sound becomes more alarming than any noise. The warp did not ignore the Draugr. The warp, in whatever sense that churning sea of psychic energy could be said to have a reaction to anything, was aware of the Draugr. And what it felt, if feeling is the right word for the warp's relationship to a thing that refused to enter its vocabulary, was something very close to unease. The witnessing eye abandoned his plan to redirect the creature and ordered the assault directly. He understood now that this thing could not be persuaded. It could only be destroyed. What he did not yet understand was how difficult that was going to be. The formal request for inquisitorial oversight arrived at the Solanum Tertius excavation site 14 days after the Draugr's awakening. It was filed by Magos Ervith Solon in a 7,000-word document that was remarkable primarily for the fact that a man of his augmented analytical capacity had needed 7,000 words to say, in essence, "I do not know what this is, and that disturbs me more than I am professionally permitted to express." Solon was not a man given to uncertainty. The Adeptus Mechanicus, as an institution, had organized its entire spiritual and intellectual existence around the premise that the universe was knowable, that every mystery was a piece of the Omnissiah's great equation waiting to be solved, that the right tools applied with sufficient patience and rigor would eventually dissolve any anomaly into comprehensible data. Solon had operated under this premise for 112 years, and it had served him well. He had cataloged alien ruins. He had reverse-engineered pre-heresy technology fragments. He had stood in the presence of fully operational Titan war engines and understood, at a fundamental level, exactly what he was looking at and why it worked the way it worked. The Draugr did not work in any way he could explain. He had managed to observe it closely enough, during periods when it remained stationary in the burial chamber, to compile an extensive physical analysis. The body was unambiguously a corpse. Cellular degradation was present throughout the biological tissue in a pattern consistent with extreme age. Internal organs had ceased functioning. Blood had long since settled and congealed. By every biological metric available to Solon's considerable array of scanning equipment, the body on that dais should have been a desiccated relic, the kind of well-preserved specimen that xenoarchaeologists discovered periodically in sealed environments and cataloged with a mixture of academic excitement and professional detachment. Instead, it had walked through 6 of his servitors. It had sustained bolter damage and regenerated, not in the rapid biological way of orc physiology or the technological way of necron reanimation, but in a slow, grinding, purposeful way that looked less like healing and more like the body was simply refusing to acknowledge that the damage had occurred, as though the oath that animated it had been granted a limited authority over physical reality, enough to insist that the vessel would continue to function because the function was not yet complete. That was what fascinated Solon above all else. Not the animation itself, which was strange enough, but the apparent purposefulness of it. There was a structure to the Draugr's behavior that implied something more organized than reflex and more constrained than free will. It did not wander. It did not explore. It did not demonstrate any apparent curiosity about its environment, despite the fact that its environment had changed dramatically from whatever conditions had existed when it was first placed in the chamber. It moved through the tunnel complex in patterns that, when mapped over 72 hours of observation, revealed a systematic circuit. It was patrolling the same corridors it had apparently patrolled at some point in the distant past, and doing so with the mechanical reliability of something that had internalized its route so completely that no amount of time or changed circumstance could alter it. What animated it? That was the question Solon's cogitators returned to in every analytical cycle. The warp was the standard answer for unexplained animation of dead tissue in the 41st millennium. Demonic possession, chaos, corruption, the residual soul energy of a particularly strong-willed individual refusing to dissipate after death. But the warp-reading instruments recorded absolutely nothing from the creature's direction. It emitted no psychic signature. It generated no fluctuation in the local warp field that Solon's instruments could detect. It was, from the perspective of every instrument designed to detect supernatural energy, simply not there. The runes on the walls, however, were a different matter. Those glowed with a constant, cold light that his instruments could not measure directly, but could detect in the way you detect a sound at the edge of your hearing range, present but not fully accessible. Something was in those runes that the instruments were not designed to read, because whatever was in them did not belong to any known energy classification. It was not warp energy. It was not electromagnetic energy. It was not the structured quantum signature of Necron phase technology. It was older than all of those things, Solon suspected, or more precisely, it operated according to a logic that predated the frameworks within which all those things existed. The runes were not technology. They were not science. They were something that the Mechanicus, with all its accumulated knowledge of the universe, had no proper word for. And that absence of vocabulary was, for Magos Ervith Solon, the most deeply unsettling fact of the entire situation. He requested additional scanning equipment from the nearest Forge world and was told the requisition would be processed within 6 to 8 months. Standard procedure. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not rush for anomalies. The Adeptus Mechanicus processed anomalies in queue order, alongside requests for replacement parts and updated cogitator cores and the 1,000 other demands of a galaxy-spanning institution that was perpetually under-resourced and over-obligated. In the meantime, Solon established a perimeter. He documented the Draugr's patrol patterns. He sent data packets to every Mechanicus archive he could contact, requesting cross-reference matches for the runic language on the walls, and received in return a cascade of negative results and one mildly interested response from an explorator fleet currently operating in a different star system that said the runes bore a passing visual similarity to pre-imperial human inscriptions recovered from the Fenris system, which had been noted in a 200-year-old survey and filed without further investigation. A world on the other side of the galaxy. A world associated with the Space Wolves chapter. A world that, in the deepest layers of its mythology, contained stories of things that slept beneath the ice and did not rest even after death. Stories that the Space Wolves themselves dismissed as old folklore, or did not discuss with outsiders at all. Solon flagged the connection in his notes and continued observing. The Draugr, oblivious to the attention, continued its patrol. It moved through the cold, rune-lit corridors with the patience of something that had done this for a very long time and expected to do it for a very long time more. It was not waiting for anything. It was simply continuing to guard. And whatever it was guarding, Solon was increasingly certain was not going to reveal itself quickly or without consequence. It was the junior archivist who found it, which was the kind of detail that would have annoyed Solon considerably if he had been in a position to feel annoyed rather than simply recalculating his threat assessments at speed. Archivist Pren Kalla was 26 years old, recently seconded to the Mechanicus excavation team from an Imperial records facility, and possessed of the particular brand of methodical stubbornness that makes for an excellent archivist and an occasionally exhausting colleague. While Solon focused his instruments on the Draugr itself, Kalla had been doing what archivists do, reading the walls. Not scanning them, not running algorithmic analysis across the runic patterns, but sitting in the outer chamber for hours at a time with hand-copied transcriptions of sections she found most dense, cross-referencing against partial translation matrices she had built herself from the Fenris connection Solon's note had flagged. The translation was incomplete and imprecise. She was the first to acknowledge that. But it was enough to understand the structure of the inscription, if not every specific word within it. And the structure, once it became visible, changed everything. The runes were not simply a decoration or a territorial marker or even a prayer, though they contained elements of all three. They were instructions. Instructions organized in 3 distinct sections, each corresponding to a different stage of a ceremonial arrangement that Kalla, working carefully and slowly with her partial matrices, eventually understood as follows. The first section described the nature of what was being protected, the second section described the terms of the protection, and the third section described the nature and identity of the protector. The third section she translated first because it was visually simplest. It described the Draugr in terms that were both stark and strangely moving. A warrior who had accepted the eternal oath, who had laid down his mortal life willingly in exchange for an immortal duty, who would stand between the relic and the world until the world itself ended, after which the terms of the oath would be renegotiated by higher authorities than any living being could speak to. The first section she translated last because it was the densest, and because, she admitted to Solon when she brought him the completed document, she had needed to verify her results 3 times before she believed them. At the back of the burial chamber behind the Draugr's dais, there was a secondary door. It had been invisible to the eye and undetectable to Solon's instruments because it was sealed with the same magic that animated the Draugr, the same old, deep, warp-absent energy that the instruments had no framework to read. The door had no handle, no mechanism, no lock in any recognizable sense. It simply existed as a wall until the moment it chose not to. And Kalla had discovered that it chose not to be a wall specifically when the Draugr was standing on the other side of the chamber. The creature's proximity to the door was apparently necessary for its function to be accessible, but the creature standing beside it was apparently not what the original designers had intended, because the door had never been meant to be used by the Draugr. The door had been meant for the person or persons the Draugr was specifically supposed to prevent from entering. Behind the door was the relic. Solon entered the inner sanctum accompanied by 2 armed soldiers and his most reliable remaining servitor, and stood for a long time without speaking in front of the object that had apparently warranted the construction of an entire fortified burial complex, the creation of an immortal guardian, and the encoding of a set of instructions so precise and so durable that they had survived, intact for a period of time no geological instrument on the planet could accurately estimate. It was a weapon. A sword specifically, though describing it simply as a sword was approximately as accurate as describing a titan as a very large soldier. The blade was long, slightly curved in a way that suggested the culture that produced it valued precision over raw power, and it was covered from hilt to tip in runes so densely packed they seemed less carved and more grown into the metal, as though the language and the steel had been created together in the same moment rather than one applied to the other. The metal itself was a dark silver that caught the light in a way that made the air around it seem slightly cooler, slightly quieter, as though the sword created a small zone of calm wherever it rested that was less about physical temperature and more about something Solon lacked the vocabulary to define. He raised his instrument array and ran a full scan. The results told him nothing he could file in any existing category. The sword emitted no energy signature. It exerted no field effect. It weighed exactly what a sword of its dimensions made of conventional metal would weigh. And yet, when the servitor Solon directed to lift it made contact with the hilt, the creature's mechanical systems logged a signal that Solon had never seen before. A momentary pause across all its systems, not a failure, not a shutdown, but a hesitation, as though something in the sword had looked at the servitor and found it inadequate and communicated that, finding through channels that did not correspond to any known form of electronic or psychic transmission. Kala's translation of the first section of the inscription described the relic in terms she had verified 3 times. A weapon capable of wounding things that cannot be wounded by conventional means. Things that existed not fully in the material world. Things that had discarded or been discarded by the natural laws governing physical matter. Things, in the terminology of the 41st millennium, that lived in the warp. The sword did not merely cut. The sword cut through the barrier between what was real and what was not, and it could reach across that barrier and make a thing that lived in the immaterial bleed in a way that was permanent and total. Against demons, this was not merely a weapon. It was an extinction. The Vox signal that reached Solon 40 seconds after he sent his first encrypted report of the finding was not from the Inquisition or from any imperial authority. It was from a jamming source he could not immediately locate, broadcasting on a frequency associated with chaos cult communications. The message was 6 words long. "We are coming. Do not resist." The assault began before dawn. Not because the witnessing eye preferred the darkness, though he did. Because the psychic pressure that his most sensitive cultists had been monitoring beneath the ground had reached a new intensity in the hours after Solon's report, an intensity that suggested the relic was in the process of being examined rather than simply existing in its sealed chamber, and the witnessing eye understood that the window between discovery and imperial lockdown was narrow. The Imperium was bureaucratically slow but institutionally thorough, and if a full inquisitorial response arrived on Solenum Tertius before he had claimed the sword, he would never claim it. Inquisitors did not negotiate. He brought everyone he had. 43 cultists armed with a mixture of stolen imperial weapons and chaos-touched implements. 3 psychers, the same 3 who had failed in their attempt to reach the Draugr through the warp, now reassigned to offensive roles and considerably more motivated. 2 Chaos Space Marines, deserters from a war band that had passed through this system 18 months ago, who remained on the planet because the witnessing eye had been generous with resources and because they found the idea of a combat operation more interesting than the alternative of continued inaction. Their armor was corroded with chaos touch and they moved with the easy, dangerous confidence of things that had survived too much to take anything particularly seriously. The Imperial Guard contingent, now reinforced to 30 soldiers following Solon's escalated requests, had prepared defensive positions in the upper tunnel levels. They had placed their heaviest weapons at corridor junctions and established overlapping fields of fire that would have been highly effective against a conventional infantry assault. Sergeant Vess, who had reorganized the defense after her initial encounter with the Draugr, had also requested that a 200-meter exclusion perimeter be maintained around the burial chamber entrance, a request she had made not out of tactical consideration but out of a personal reluctance to be in the same room as the Draugr again, unless absolutely necessary. The battle in the upper tunnels was brutal and brief. The Chaos Space Marines went in first, moving through the prepared defensive positions with the casual efficiency of warriors who had spent centuries learning that most obstacles were softer than they appeared. Imperial soldiers died. Some of them died well, taking one of the Chaos Marines down to a single functioning arm with a focused burst of crack grenades. But the tactical outcome was not in question, and everyone present understood that within 6 minutes of first contact, the witnessing eye descended into the lower tunnels with his psychers and 12 surviving cultists, moving through corridors now lit by the dull red emergency lighting of a battle site, stepping over the scattered remnants of a fight that had lasted barely long enough to feel dignified. Then he reached the burial chamber level and found the Draugr waiting. It stood in the corridor junction at the center of its patrol route, lit by the runes that had never stopped glowing, holding its ancient sword in both hands with the unhurried stillness of something that had been expecting this exact moment. Perhaps it had been expecting this exact moment since the day it accepted the oath. Perhaps it had been built to recognize the particular flavor of threat that the witnessing eye represented. The warp-touched intent of a man who had bent his will toward the corrupted forces that the sword behind it was specifically designed to wound. The Draugr did not wait for them to attack first. It moved, still not fast, still not the blurring sprint of a space marine or the frantic charge of a berserker, but with a directness so complete that it was more terrifying than speed would have been. It moved toward the largest concentration of threat with the calm, considered purposefulness of a guardian executing a function it had been designed for. And it hit the lead Chaos Space Marine with a force that drove the much larger figure backward 3 full meters and into the tunnel wall hard enough to crack stone. The Psychers attacked from range. Warp energy crackled down the corridor in bolts of dissonant light. The energy hit the Draugr and spread across the surface of its ancient armor in patterns that looked less like damage and more like the warp trying to find purchase on a material it could not grip. The runes on the Draugr's own armor, the same script that covered the burial chamber walls, responded to the warp energy with a visible intensification of their cold blue light, as though the magic bound into the warrior's form recognized the nature of the attack and was specifically opposed to it. The battle spread through the lower tunnel complex in a chaos that was both literal and figurative. Imperial soldiers, recognizing that the chaos assault had reached the lower levels, pushed forward from the rear, and now the tunnels contained a 3-way conflict. Chaos cultists pressing toward the inner chamber, Imperial forces pressing to retake the lower corridors, and the Draugr moving through both with the single-minded clarity of something that did not distinguish between the two factions in any morally significant sense. You were in its tomb. You were a threat to what it guarded. The distinction between which banner you carried was not a consideration that its ancient, oath-bound logic contained any provision for. The second Chaos Space Marine died on the Draugr's blade in the corridor outside the inner sanctum. The sword punched through chaos-touched ceramite plate as though the material offered no more resistance than old cloth, and where the blade passed through the corrupted warrior, the warp residue that clung to the Space Marine's corrupted soul visibly recoiled, burned off in a clean, cold light that had nothing in it of the warp and everything in it of something older and more fundamental. The Space Marine collapsed and did not rise again in any form. The Psychers fell back. The surviving cultists fell back. The witnessing eye stood at the edge of the combat zone and watched the ancient warrior stand between him and everything he had come for, and understood for the first time, with the cold clarity of a man whose plan has just made contact with reality, that he had brought the wrong tools to a very old problem. He had brought the warp to fight something that the warp could not touch. The Draugr was damaged. There was no honest account of this battle that omitted that fact. The crack grenades had done what bolter rounds and last fire had not quite managed. They had compromised the structural integrity of the ancient armor in 3 places, and through those gaps the underlying body had sustained damage that would have been catastrophic for anything with a biological requirement to remain functional. The right arm moved with a grinding resistance that had not been present earlier in the fight. The ancient fur trim of the armor had burned away entirely. One of the decorative crests on the helmet had been sheared off by a fragment of explosive, and the cold light in the creature's eyes, while still present, was subtly dimmer than it had been when the battle began, the way a fire is dimmer when the fuel has been burning for a long time. It did not stop. That remained the singular fact of the Draugr's existence throughout every phase of this engagement, and it remained the singular fact now, in this final phase, when the witnessing eye abandoned his position of observation and stepped forward himself. He was not a combat specialist. He was an administrator who had been touched by a god's attention and had mistaken that attention for an elevation of his own fundamental worth. But he carried a warp-infused blade gifted to him by an entity whose name he preferred not to say aloud, and the blade thrummed with a dark energy that had eaten through armor and flesh and stone with equal efficiency in the handful of times he had used it. He believed, as he advanced toward the damaged and slowing guardian, that he was witnessing the end of something. He was correct. He had simply misidentified which end. The Draugr turned to face him, and the runes on its armor flared. Not the steady, cold glow they had maintained throughout the battle. This was different. A pulsing, intensifying light that spread from the armor to the floor and to the walls and to the air itself. The runes on every surface of the burial complex responding to the proximity of the warp-touched blade in the hands of the witnessing eye, as though the whole ancient system was recognizing the exact category of threat it had been built to address. The tomb had been constructed for this moment. The Draugr had been placed in this tomb for this moment. And the relic behind the sealed door had been hidden here precisely because someone a very long time ago had understood that a day would come when something corrupted and ambitious would walk down a tunnel toward a sword that could destroy it. The witnessing eye's blade met the Draugr's ancient sword in the narrow corridor, and the contact produced no sound that belonged to metal striking metal. It produced a silence, brief and total, the kind of silence that occurs when two opposing principles meet at the exact point of their maximum opposition and cancel each other in a moment of pure negation. Then the silence broke and both figures stepped back. The witnessing eye's blade was dark, not damaged. The warp energy that had animated it had simply ceased, burned out against the old magic of the Guardian's weapon like a flame pressed against cold stone. The Draugr advanced for the final time. It was slower now. Every step was an act of will over deterioration. The damage in the right arm had spread. The body was losing coherence in a way that suggested the oath's ability to maintain it against compounding damage had reached its operational limit. But the oath was not finished. The oath was not finished until the threat was resolved, and so the body continued, grinding and crumbling and still advancing, because the alternative was incompatible with the terms of the agreement made by the warrior in it, a very long time ago, when it had been a living man who understood the price of the oath and accepted it anyway. The witnessing eye ran, not a strategic retreat. A run, the kind performed by a man who has looked into the eyes of something ancient and implacable and understood, at a level more fundamental than thought, that there is no argument to be made and no deal to be offered. His surviving cultists scattered. The tunnel complex filled with the sound of running feet and shouted, fragmented commands, and underneath it all, the slow, steady, grinding rhythm of the Guardian's footsteps as it followed them to the edge of its territory and then stopped. It did not pursue beyond the boundary of the tomb. It never had. The oath was not to hunt. The oath was to protect. The Draugr stood at the boundary of the burial complex's outer corridor, and the remaining Imperial soldiers who had pressed forward from the upper levels found themselves facing it from 10 meters distance. Nobody fired. Nobody moved. The creature stood there for a long moment in the silence after battle, lit by the fading runes, and then something in it seemed to reach a decision or a conclusion or an end. It walked back to the dais. It lay down. The sword came to rest on its chest beneath crossed hands. The rune light on the walls dimmed, slowly and evenly, until the chamber was dark except for the ambient glow of Imperial emergency lighting that had no business being here but was here anyway, bearing witness to something that had no place in its universe and that had done its work regardless. When Sergeant Vess entered the chamber 30 seconds later and swept her light across the resting figure, she found a form that was no longer a warrior standing at a post. It was dust-wearing armor, settled into the shape of the oath it had held, the body finally released from the function it had been maintained to perform. The sword remained. The dais remained. The runes on the wall remained. The Guardian was gone. The relic was safe. The official report filed by Inquisitorial Representative Yana Strel, who arrived on Solenum Tertius 11 days after the battle, was 16 pages long and classified at a level that meant fewer than 40 people in the entire Imperium would ever read it in its unredacted form. The summary available to lower clearance personnel described the incident as a contained chaos cult disruption at an archaeological site, the discovery of a dangerous xenotech artifact, and the neutralization of the cult leadership. Standard boilerplate. The kind of summary that gets filed and forgotten in the vast archives of Imperial administration, lost among 10,000 similar summaries generated across 10,000 similar incidents in Galaxy, where unusual things happen with such relentless frequency that unusual things are, in the aggregate, entirely ordinary. The relic was removed. Strel did not specify where it was taken. and no record of its destination appears in any archive accessible to anyone without inquisitorial authorization. It is likely in a vault somewhere. The Imperium has many vaults. The Imperium is, at a structural level, an organization built around the premise that the correct response to dangerous things is to put them in a vault and then put the vault on a planet and then put the planet in a classified file and then lose the file in a bureaucratic system that is actively hostile to efficient retrieval. This is not a criticism. In a universe as generously supplied with dangerous things as the 41st millennium, it may be the only reasonable policy. The burial complex was sealed. Mechanicus demolition servitors collapsed the upper tunnel network with precisely calibrated explosive charges, and the planet was reclassified in Imperial records from potential resource site to restricted access. No reason given for the restriction beyond a reference number that connected back to Strel's sealed report. Any future surveyor checking the planet's record would find the restriction, note the inquisitorial reference, and move on without further inquiry. Standard procedure. The Imperium does not encourage curiosity about things that have been deliberately made difficult to be curious about. But the soldiers talked, not officially, not in reports, in the way that soldiers talk after things they have seen that did not fit neatly into the vocabulary of their experience, in mess halls and barracks and the long, dark transit hours of troop ships moving between systems. They talked about the thing in the tunnels, about how it had walked through bolter fire, about how it had fought chaos without being chaos, had held a boundary against the warp without being of the warp, had crumbled into dust not because it had been defeated, but because its work was done, and the ancient logic that had maintained it saw no reason to continue once the work was complete. They talked about the runes that had glowed in the dark, about the cold, patient light in the creature's eyes, about the sound of its footsteps in the corridor, slow and even and absolutely certain. The sound of something that had never for a single moment doubted that it would keep moving until the thing it was moving toward was resolved. Archivist Kala, reassigned to a different posting after Strel determined she knew too much to remain near the site and too little to be a useful asset, spent the next 3 years cross-referencing the fragments of translation she had completed against every partial reference to pre-imperial Nordic human cultures she could access through legitimate channels. She published nothing. The Inquisition had been politely but unmistakably clear about the limits of her permitted activities on this topic. But she kept notes, private notes, in a cipher she had invented herself, and those notes contained a hypothesis she found she could not abandon regardless of its professional inconvenience. The Draugr had not been native to Solenum Tertius. The burial complex had been built there, placed deliberately on a world at the edge of explored space, precisely because the edge of explored space is the last place anyone goes looking for things they need to find. Someone a long time ago, perhaps before the Imperium existed, perhaps before the current age of mankind had fully taken shape, had understood that the sword needed to be hidden, and that the hiding needed to be permanent, and that permanent hiding required a guardian who did not die. And her notes contained one further observation, added on the last page in handwriting that was slightly less precise than her usual standard, the kind of handwriting that appears when a thought arrives faster than the hand is prepared for. If this one was here, how many others are there? How many worlds at the edge of records contain sealed corridors with rune-lit walls, and a warrior lying still on a stone dais, waiting for the moment when the seals are broken and the eyes open, and the ancient oath calls the guardian back to its feet? The Imperium is vast. Its unexplored edges are vaster still. And beneath the surfaces of forgotten worlds, in chambers that no survey probe has yet reached and no survey team has yet been assigned to investigate, the cold light of ancient runes may still be burning, steady and patient and waiting. If those tombs ever open again, the Draugr will rise. It always does.